The climate change is the single most important problem that we're going to deal with in our lifetime. And this, isn't particularly surprising to anyone who pays attention, but you are kind of dealing in the book with more of the politics involved. Can you just explain this to us a little bit?
We kind of know what happens physically at various, 1 degree hotter, 2 degrees hotter. But what hasn't got a lot of attention is what happens politically, what happens strategically. For example, Australia is the driest continent. So if there's going to be the effects of this sort, that's where you'd expect them to show up first. And they are showing up, or at least that's what Australians are coming to think. They're in the 7th year of what they call the big dry. They're beginning to suspect, in fact, they're pretty well convinced, that this is not an ordinary drought, because the droughts end, right? Maybe this is climate change, in which case this is the new normal, and we're not going back to what normally happens at the end of droughts. The rain's not coming back. That huge export industry that was inland Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin and so on, where they grew the wheat and all the other grain that they exported and fed half of Asia with, is out of commission. Indonesia and the Philippines, which are right north of Australia, they're going to be drying out too. And so the Australians have just actually bought a whole new fleet of ocean-going patrol vessels because they can see waves of people fleeing south from farms that no longer produce to Australia where there might be work. Take 2 or 3 more regions out, and you've got an overall world food shortage. Mr. Obama is promising to get the U.S. back to 1990 levels of emissions by 2020.
There may be plenty of room for debate as to how we transition from fossil fuels to renewable fuels. We all understand there's no silver bullet to do it, but there's no question that we must do all these things.
And he's promising 80% cuts in American emissions by 2050. The game's over by 2030. That's way too late. Guys, what you're promising is that you won't be worse than you were 20 years ago if you give us another 10 years. That's not good enough.
Are people sufficiently scared?
If you go somewhere above 2 degrees, but probably well before 3, you start melting the permafrost and enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and methane, which is an even worse gas for warming, come out. There's enough carbon dioxide locked up in the permafrost to double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, these are feedbacks you can't control. You can't cool the permafrost back down. You can't cool the ocean surface back down. You could get your own emissions down to 0 sometime later, and it wouldn't stop the warming because it's taken over natural processes. So, for those 2 reasons, you mustn't go past 2 degrees hotter. So there is a deadline. We need people to be scared because, fear moves people. It gets them moving, and we do need to move pretty fast on this stuff.